As promised, this is the narrated PowerPoint that follows up and finishes our discussion about difficult conversations. So we did see this slide in class, and you completed the style under stress test that gives you a sense of how you're most likely to behave when you're stressed out and in the midst of or about to have a difficult conversation. For the rest of this PowerPoint, I want you to think about a real conversation that you have had or that you know you need to have that you would construe as difficult, one where the person with whom you need to engage in dialogue has a different opinion than you, where maybe there are high emotions, where maybe there are serious stakes. It could be a conversation that you might have with a roommate or a parent or a boss or a coworker, a friend, a teammate. Again, imagine a real difficult conversation that you have had or that you know you need to have. As you think about that conversation, whether it's happened in the past or it's forthcoming, think carefully about what you do want to have happen as a result of that conversation. Do you want to be in a better relationship with that person? Is it just some particular objective that you have in mind that you're hoping to accomplish through that dialogue? What, again, specifically do you want? And what don't you want to have happen? For example, do you not want to have hurt the other person's feelings? Do you not want to have walked away with less than what you came into the conversation with? Do you not want to feel badly yourself? So take some time and list, perhaps in 2 columns, what you do want and what you don't want. Now, this slide says individually and in pairs. Obviously, you're doing this just by yourself. So pause the PowerPoint and write out what you do want and what you don't want. Now that you've articulated what you want and don't want, you need to think about building safety. So which of a couple of conditions is at risk? For example, is it mutual purpose? Think about your intent going into this conversation as you plan to engage in this dialogue. How does the other person know that your intent is positive, that you want good things to come out of this conversation? Some signs that mutual purpose might be at risk: you end up debating, sort of talking past each other, where each of you says things, but those things don't necessarily reflect back on what the other person has said. Maybe you or the other person becomes defensive. Maybe it seems as though there's some hidden agenda, so you're saying one thing, but maybe there's something else that you really want, or the other person's saying something, but there's something else that they really want. Maybe you start to accuse each other. Maybe you circle back, where instead of moving forward in the conversation, you keep returning to points that maybe you thought were resolved. You need to ask yourself, does that other person with whom you're engaging, does that person believe that you care about their goals, not just yours? Do they trust your motives? How do you know that they trust your motives, your intent? So with mutual purpose, thinking about that real conversation, maybe again one you've had, one that you're planning to have, what could you actually say that will convey that you care about that other person, that you share their interests, their values, their purpose? In other words, that you want to be on the same page with them, that you want good things to come out of this conversation, that your intent is positive. Jot down, write down, what could you actually say? What words could you use to convey to that person your care and your willingness to share their interests, values, and purpose. Go ahead and pause the narrated PowerPoint so you can do this. In addition to mutual purpose, we also need to think about mutual respect. It's also called the continuance condition. There's this great quote here that respect is like air. If you take it away, that's all the people can think about. People want and need to feel respected. All people want and need to feel respected, to have their dignity as a human being acknowledged. So, does that person with whom you need to have this conversation, does that person believe that you respect them? And ask yourself, can you respect people you don't respect? Can you convey a degree of respect even when in fact your feelings, you might not be very happy with them right now, but can you still acknowledge who they are as a human being? So this past Saturday, one of the things that I did when I was in Des Moines visiting with my goddaughter is we went to see the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, speak. Now, regardless of your politics, whether you're more conservative, more liberal, just keep in mind that we're talking about the Speaker of the House, someone who has been duly elected by her constituents and then duly elected to the position of Speaker of the House. And as the majority changes in the House of Representatives, the Speaker of the House changes accordingly. It serves no purpose for anyone to think, I only respect the Speaker who represents the party that I affiliate myself with. Don't go there, folks. Try to be more broad-minded. Try to think more critically. Anyway, during her remarks, she talked about what is now sort of a famous photograph that was taken of her, Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, in conversation with President Donald Trump. And she is standing while he's sitting. And someone in the audience asked the question, what can you tell us about that photograph, about the meeting associated with that photograph? And I got to tell you something that impressed me greatly about Speaker Pelosi. She acknowledged the question, first of all, and then she said, she commented on how important she thinks it is to respect each other, to respect the person who occupies the role of president, to respect her fellow members of Congress, regardless of their political affiliation, to understand what it means when we are duly elected by people and the responsibility that we have, specifically the responsibility that those legislators and the president have to the Constitution. When they're sworn in, they're sworn very specifically, they have very specific responsibilities to the Constitution. And so that's how she framed that conversation. What came across very clearly was that while they had disagreed, she and the president, her disagreement was respectful. So no matter what she may or may not think about President Donald Trump personally, she was able to convey her respect for him as a human being. And I think this is something that is often lost in conversation, perhaps even more so now than in the past, is we struggle to demonstrate respect for others. We equate the fact that we maybe disagree with their position or their thinking, and we decide, therefore, because of that disagreement, we no longer need to treat them respectfully. And what she was describing was the opposite of that. Instead, an alignment with what you see on this slide, that we must find a way to honor each person's basic humanity. That what we need to do is to focus on our similarities, not on our differences, so that we can, in fact, do the work that we need to do, which is to solve complex problems, to seek some agreement, to figure out where we are on the same page, so that we can then tackle those areas, those topics where we have substantive differences. But it's critical to start by respecting the other person's basic humanity. So even when you're in an intense disagreement with a roommate, with a parent, with a sibling, with a coworker, with a boss, a teammate, et cetera, respect who they are as a person. So, thinking about that real conversation you're planning to have. If you suspect that that other person may not feel respected by you, if there are, for example, things you've said in the past, behaviors that you've engaged in the past that have sent the message to that person that you do not respect their basic humanity, what are some things you could say to restore that respect? How might you approach this issue of mutual respect? Not asking the other person to respect you. That's not where you're going here. Instead, what can you say to them to make it clear that you respect them? Go ahead and pause the PowerPoint, take a few minutes, write down some real thoughts. Some key skills for all of this. Apologize. Apologize. If you've made a mistake, and you have, there's no question about it, we all do, go ahead and apologize. What is it that matters most? Are there any drawbacks to apologizing? Certainly, potentially, depending on how you frame that apology. But an example of apologizing and doing this well is you know that, for example, you maybe in living with a roommate haven't always done your fair share of the tasks. To be able to say, I know that whether we agreed to it openly or not, essentially, since we live together, there's a tacit agreement, an unspoken agreement that we will fairly distribute the chores that need to be done. And I know that I haven't always followed through as I need to, and I'm sorry for that. That has not respected your time. That has privileged my time over yours. I regret that I've behaved this way. Apologizing is critically important. When I got married more than 3 decades ago, one of the pieces of advice that the priest offered to us was that we should always keep in mind several words and phrases, and it started with, I'm sorry. The next phrase was, I made a mistake. The next word was please. The next phrase was thank you. And the final one was I love you. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Please, thank you, I love you. And the priest admonished both my husband and I to use those words and phrases frequently, to not hold them close, but rather to share those words, to put those phrases out there, to acknowledge, for example, in this case, that, we all make mistakes. When someone else misinterprets your purpose or intent, then we need to set up a contrast. This is not an apology. This is something else. So this is a do or a don't statement that addresses others' concerns, that you don't respect them or that you have a negative purpose. So I don't want to end up where I'm just the winner and you're a loser in this conversation. I don't want us to be adversaries. I don't want us to be on opposite sides of the fence, followed by a statement that confirms your respect or clarifies your purpose. This is the do part. However, I do want both of us to be satisfied with whatever outcome we agree to. I do want us to be able to go forward with a commitment to openly respecting one another. So what you don't want, followed by what you do want. So go ahead, again, pause the PowerPoint and take a moment to write down what you don't want, what you do want. Next, we talk about creating a mutual purpose. Crib. So we have to commit to seeking mutual purpose. And this is something you can talk through with your person. Again, your roommate, a teammate, a parent, a sibling, a coworker, a boss, etc., where you talk about this idea of We need to collaboratively agree. This isn't about one person winning and another person losing. We want to both win. Let's state that openly, make our commitment public. We need to recognize the purpose behind the strategy. What's the real purpose? What is it that each of us really wants? And why do we want that? Why is it so important, for example, that we fairly distribute the chores in our household? Why is it so important, if you're talking with a leader, that you get feedback on a regular basis? Why is it, when you're talking with a parent, that you need them to give you greater autonomy in your decision making? Why does that matter? So clarifying the why. Then making sure that you have mutual purpose. Invent that mutual purpose. Create superordinate rules. This is the goal or the rule, okay, that is bigger than both of us. Is there a higher or longer term purpose that can motivate all of us? For example, in talking with parents about wanting greater autonomy, what both parties want ultimately is that you, as an adult, will be able to make effective decisions going forward, even when you don't have the benefit of parental counsel, for example. You need to develop confidence around making decisions. So that's why it's so important to have autonomy at this point. That serves them well because they'll know that they've done a good job raising you, etc. And then finally, brainstorming new strategies, thinking outside the box. What are some solutions that we can come up with that neither of us came up with alone before we had this conversation? What can we together brainstorm as to how we move forward in this relationship, as to how we try in the future to not end up in a difficult situation? What are some things that we together agree we might do? Of course, it's important to understand your conflict management style. You've seen this. You'll see this again. It talks on the bottom of the slide about completing the conflict management styles assessment. Basically, and you could just disregard that particular note. Essentially, each of us has a preferred mode of managing conflict. These 5 options are based upon the degree to which we care about being cooperative versus the degree to which we care about being assertive. When we're uncooperative and unassertive, so we don't care about anything, we just avoid. When we want to be cooperative and we're not particularly concerned about our own needs, we'll accommodate. When our own needs are everything and we don't care about being cooperative, we engage in competing or forcing. When we've put both sides' interests at the top, in other words, we want to be highly cooperative and we want to make sure that we're getting our way, well, then we're going to collaborate. And then the middle of the road option, the compromising option, where basically both parties lose because we're both giving things up. The one that's a win-win is collaborating. Avoiding is a lose-lose. Competing is a I win, you lose. Accommodating is I lose, you win. Compromising is, again, we both lose. We can talk more about this at a different point. Some common pitfalls in dialogue, so conversation. We need to master our stories. Basically, what I'm talking about here is the stories that we have in our head. And we invent all kinds of stories. These give us the rationale for what's going on, what we see, what we perceive. They help us to understand why, how, what, so why the person is doing what they're doing, how things are unfolding the way they are, what's going on. Even when we don't realize it, we're busy telling ourselves stories. We're coming up with theories, tacit theories, as to what's going on and why. In reality, any set of facts can be used to tell an infinite number of stories. There are any number of ways to construe the same set of facts to be understood. And this is why in many cases it's valuable for us to talk through our situations, our conflicts, our difficulties with other people. As we lay out what we observe in terms of the facts, they may perceive those facts quite differently than we do, and maybe tell a different story, some other way that connects those facts. If we can take control of our stories, first of all, recognizing that we're doing that, and then really saying, hey, now wait a minute, slow down. Why am I thinking what I'm thinking? Well, if we can do all of that, then those stories won't control us. The path to action, where we're doing, we see and hear, we tell ourselves a story. So we see and hear what a person has been doing or not doing. We tell ourselves a story. That causes us to feel some particular set of emotions, and then we act. So again, notice everything is based on our perceptions. So we see and hear things using all the filters that we have that are a function of our experiences, our previous perceptions, our personality, etc. We tell ourselves a story that causes us to feel certain emotions, and then we act on those emotions. How do we go ahead and master our stories? Well, first we have to begin by trying to retrace our path from act to see and hear. So how do we get from acting, we did something, what was the feeling that preceded that action? What was the story that we told ourselves that caused us to feel the way we did? And then what did we actually see or hear? So we decide to lash out at someone, to call them on the carpet, because we're feeling angry. And it's because we've told ourselves that they're not treating us equitably. And that could be perhaps because they haven't talked to us recently, or we feel as though we're always having to initiate the conversation. So that's an example of retracing our path. Notice our behavior. What sort of step outside yourself? What are you doing? What's that action? Get in touch with your feelings. Not just that they're positive or negative, but really try to label them. Are you angry? Are you frustrated? Are you disappointed? Are you ecstatic? Are you joyful? Are you surprised? What are your feelings? Really try to identify them, to label them. Then analyze those stories. What story are you telling yourself? Trying to explain that person's behavior, trying to explain what you're observing, what you're seeing and hearing. Is that story based in current facts? Is it a function of sort of, this is a story that you often tell yourself? Question your feelings and stories, and don't confuse stories with facts. What you've seen, what you've heard, what's actually happening versus how you're interpreting all of that. I see the dirty dishes piled up next to the sink. The story, man, my roommate is the laziest person I have ever known. They never want to do their fair share of the work. What I just described is the story. The facts, there are dishes sitting by the sink. Get back to the facts. Focus on the behavior or the lack of behavior, and watch for hot words, accusatory words. And then make sure you tell the rest of the story. That's coming up next. 3 clever stories that we might tell ourselves. Again, it could be you're dealing with roommates, you're dealing with teammates, siblings, parents, coworkers, a boss, customers. The victim story. It's not my fault. If you find yourself always describing yourself in your head as this innocent victim, okay? The person who's always the long-suffering, the one who's always getting screwed, the one who's never getting what they deserve, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what you got to do is step outside of that passive role and remember that, in fact, you do play an active role. What is your role in the problem? What are you doing or not doing that is enabling that behavior? Negative behavior is enabled behavior. It happens because people are somehow being reinforced for that behavior. What are you doing to reinforce that behavior? Don't just go with the I'm being picked on. This person doesn't know how to treat me well. What is your role in all of this? Story. The villain story, where you say it's all your fault. Basically, where you label or vilify others. They're just a bad person. They're just a terrible human being. They don't know how to treat other people. They're not a good person, etc. No one would want to be their roommate. No one would want to be their child. No one would want to be their direct report. Well, the approach to this story is to turn them into human beings. Again, to think carefully about why would a reasonable, rational, decent person do what this person is doing. Assume that the behavior is rooted in a rational decision, meaning one that there's a reason for it, okay? It's not because the person's a bad person. It's not because the person is trying to mess with you. It's not because of anything negative. Try to think of what would be the at least neutral and maybe even positive reason why a person might do what they're doing. I had a boss, for example, who just didn't give me feedback. And for a long time I thought, what a jerk, what a tool. Why doesn't this person do what he's supposed to do, which is give me feedback on my performance so I know how to improve? And then, in thinking about it, it's like, okay, well, what else could explain this person's behavior? If instead of thinking about this person as a jerk, what if I just assume that there's a good reason why this person doesn't give me feedback? So then I could imagine things like, this person doesn't give me feedback because he assumes I know that I'm doing a good job, or that if I wanted specific feedback, I would ask for it at a given point in time, around a given task, etc. Or maybe it's as simple as the person is super busy, and of all the things on the person's to-do list, unfortunately, giving me feedback isn't near the top of their list. All of that starts with me realizing, hey, this person is not a villain. The helpless story. There's nothing else I can do. Well, we need to ask ourselves, what do I want for myself, for others, for the relationship? Kill that fool's choice that makes you feel helpless. Turn that into you're actually able. What could I do right now if I really wanted these results? You're not getting feedback from a boss? How else might you get feedback? How else can you discover how well you're doing and if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing? In other words, think constructively about how you might approach the situation differently. Don't just be there as, oh, there's nothing, I've tried everything, there's nothing else I can do. No, actually there probably is something that you could do. Why do we tell these stories? Well, sometimes they actually match reality. Sometimes they get us off the hook. They keep us from having to acknowledge our role in the conflict. They also keep us from acknowledging our own sellouts. The times where, yeah, we haven't done what we needed to do in order to keep that relationship healthy. Attribution theory, of course, plays into this. As you know, this is a theory that explains how individuals pinpoint the causes of their own and others' behavior. We engage in either internal or external attributions. With internal attributions, we say, the reason that person misbehaved, did something they shouldn't have done, didn't do something they should have done, that's all within their control. They chose not to help me out. They chose not to do their fair share. They chose to try and micromanage my life. As opposed to external attributions, where we attribute events to something outside of a person's control, where instead of saying, oh, that person is late because they're lazy and they're terrible at time management, we say, oh, they're late. There must have been, maybe there was traffic, or maybe there was something that kept them up late. Maybe they're not feeling well. In other words, things that they don't control. Maybe that's what's responsible for their behavior. The fundamental attribution error is when we look at other people and our go-to is to always say, that's on them. They could be better, but they're not because they choose not to be. We tend not to think about external explanations for other people's behavior. For example, the fact that they themselves have not received good mentoring in their role as a boss, or that they have too much on their plate and their boss isn't doing a good job of managing the situation, making it possible for them to do what they should be doing. Self-serving bias, on the other hand, is the tendency to attribute our own successes to us. So I'm awesome. When something goes my way, it's because I worked so hard. It's because I'm smart. And when things don't go my way, to attribute those failures to external causes. Well, it's the other people on my team. They didn't do what they needed to do. My boss didn't give me the resources that I needed, etc. So we're quick to judge others harshly and quick to give ourselves accolades. I'm sure you can think of examples from your own life where you have blamed other people's behavior on things internal to them, and then when you've not done so well, you've blamed external causes. I'm sure you can come up with some examples. I love this little meme. You know, that I took first steps at 4 months old. I must be some kind of genius. This is, again, the positive side of self-serving bias. Fell down, crack in the sidewalk. So there's an external attribution. Again, this is a great example of self-serving bias. When it goes well, it's because I'm amazing. When things don't go well, it's because of something outside of me. One of the things you have to do is to state, so you're in this conversation, is to state your path persuasively, not abrasively. So sometimes we have tough messages that we need to share with people, and we need to be careful. So we've got to share what we're trying to communicate in a way that maintains safety and respect. So we want to be confident about what we're saying, but also humble and diplomatic. So this is why it's so important when we're going to have a difficult conversation with someone, assuming that we have the time to plan for the difficult conversation. It's so important to take the time to write down, if not precisely what we plan to say, at least the gist of what we plan to say, so that we can do so tactfully, diplomatically, respectfully, where we're making our case without trying to make the other person feel small. So this all starts with retracing our own path to action. So we're at a given point. Well, what feelings caused us to want to act in that way? What stories did we tell ourselves? What did we see? What did we observe? Again, think about that real conversation that you're planning to have and how you're going to balance confidence and humility, sort of an aggressive or assertive posture, but also humble, recognizing that you do not have all of the data. You don't know everything. You can't possibly know everything. That's where the humility comes into play. So, state your path. Share your facts. This is what I've observed. This is what I've heard. Tell your story. This is how I've interpreted. Ask for others' paths. What did you see? How do you interpret what you've seen? Speak very tentatively. I'm not sure. I think, I imagine, I suspect, I hope, and then encourage testing. What if we were to do this? Could we maybe try that? In other words, making sure that the other person understands you really are trying to engage in shared problem solving. This is not about you winning. This is about both of you winning. This requires you to actually listen to others, something we all know we're quite terrible at. So getting ready to listen requires us to be sincere, to be curious. Why is the other person seeing what they're seeing? Well, what are they seeing? What are they observing? What do they think? Staying curious and being patient, not rushing the other person to explain, not forcing them to accept the words that make the most sense to you, but really being patient with them and encouraging them to retrace their path. They've acted a certain way. What feelings were they feeling that caused them to want to behave that way? What story did they tell themselves? In other words, how did they interpret what they observed? What did they actually observe? So encouraging people to retrace their path. We can also ask, mirror, paraphrase, or prime. So ask to get things rolling. Let's have this conversation. Mirror people's feelings. What I hear you saying, You're saying you feel this way. I understand this. I have felt this way. I feel similarly. I maybe feel a bit differently. Paraphrase, acknowledging the person's story, what I hear you saying again. What I heard was, if I heard you correctly, etc. And then prime, when you're getting nowhere, ask questions gently, tactfully, respectfully. Remember, we want to end up in a good place at the end of this conversation. So ask the person to go back to that agreement that we will be mutually respectful. But what if the other person is wrong? Remember our ABCs. Agree, build, compare. There has to be something that we can agree upon. There's always something we can all agree upon. Think of the most difficult, the most aggressive, the most disagreeable conversation you can imagine. It could be political, it could be religious. There's still something that can be agreed upon. I love my country. You love our country. We both love our country. There's an agreement. How can we build upon that, knowing that we agree upon this aspect, this feature, this statement? What else might we say we agree upon? And then compare. I feel this way. I think this thing. How do you feel about that? How do you think about that? How are we different? How are we the same? Is there anything that we still have in common around this topic? Where are specifically the points of disagreement? And then move to action. We need to decide how we're going to decide. So if you imagine yourself as a leader, that's the place I want you to go as you look at this slide. Maybe you make the decision ultimately alone. You should recognize this from Intro to Org Behavior. Maybe you consult, or maybe you let other people make the decision. You need to decide which approach is most comfortable for you and when. So when do you prefer to make decisions alone? When do you prefer to consult with other people? When are you totally okay with just letting other people go ahead and make a decision? The next piece, and this relates to the other handout I gave to you, turning ideas into habits. So we've talked a lot about how to have these difficult conversations, but ultimately, you've got to turn this into a habit. You're not going to have this PowerPoint handout at the ready all of the time. So how can you turn mastering these difficult conversations into a habit? That handout that you have takes you through each of these pieces so that you can understand what is it going to take for you to create this habit, this ability to engage successfully in difficult or crucial conversations. As I said at the very beginning of this module, you will engage. You will have to engage in difficult or crucial conversations throughout your life, both professionally and personally, with coworkers, direct reports, bosses, siblings, parents, folks who are your significant other. I mean, it goes on, customers, it goes on and on. You're going to have these conversations. There's no way to avoid these conversations. So rather than trying to avoid them, why not seek to be really good at them? So take the time to read this article and to reflect upon what will it take for you to create the habit of engaging successfully in difficult conversations. Of everything that's covered in this particular module. It all starts with heart. We need to look for safety problems. We're going to have this conversation. We need to somehow make it safe for people to participate in these conversations. Remember what we're trying to accomplish here. This isn't about winning, not for ourselves anyway, not solely for ourselves, but rather for this relationship. We want this to be a positive relationship. Therefore, we need to have a conversation that demonstrates our mutual respect for each other, where we identify our mutual purpose, where we come up with strategies for going forward that reflect both of our needs and concerns. We got to master the stories we tell ourselves. We do this all the time. We observe things, we take things in through our senses, and then we interpret what we have taken in by telling ourselves stories. We need to state our path, where we share the facts, what we've observed, tell our story. How did we interpret those facts? Ask other people to tell us about their path. Speak tentatively, with humility, and encourage testing. What if? Why don't we? Could we? Explore others' paths. You know, we have this tendency to think that we're right, that of course we have carefully thought about whatever it is, and others are perhaps neglectful. But in reality, other people may in fact have a better, more effective, more respectful way of thinking about what we're both observing. And then move to action that reflects that conversation, that difficult conversation that you've had, and what you've agreed to do going forward. Concluding thoughts. Things for you to ponder. That it's not about communication, but rather it's about results. I'd ask you to think about whether you agree or disagree with this statement, and if so, why or why not. Ultimately, is it the outcomes of our conversation that matter? Is it the process? What do you think? Then, as you reflect upon this module and everything we've talked about, what's one thing that you're thinking or feeling differently about now as you consider these difficult conversations? Ones that you've had with people, ones that you know you'll have to have going forward. Do you have any ways of thinking or feeling differently than you did before we started this module? And then, given what we've done, given what I've asked you to think about, what's one thing, just one thing, that you might do as a result of the work that you've done not only today, but over the course of 2 previous classes? What's one thing that you might do out of all the things we've talked about? It could be as simple as starting to recognize your stories when you tell them to yourself. It could be as simple as always stopping and telling yourself, this person with whom I'm having this conversation is a human being and deserves my respect. Just one thing that you will do. That's it. For this module on difficult or crucial conversations, I would strongly recommend that you read the book that talks about crucial conversations. I'm happy to lend it or give you a reference so that you can see how you might access the book. It's an easy read. Again, it's something that you will have to do, and if you can do it well, wow, you will be not only an amazing person, you'll be an amazing leader. People will come to you and ask you, how can they do this stuff better? Thanks for listening.